My name is Melanie Ford. I'm 41. And 5 weeks ago, at 6:48 on a Tuesday evening, my sister texted me a photo of a decorated ballroom, a menu card, and a single line underneath it. Wire me $7,200 tonight for Ava's Sweet 16. Deposits due tomorrow morning. I had not agreed to pay for any part of my niece's birthday party. I had not been asked. I had not even known, until that text, that a venue had been booked at all. I sat with my phone for exactly 10 minutes, not responding, while I opened my banking app and did something I probably should have done weeks earlier, and confirmed something I had started to suspect the moment I saw the word deposits due tomorrow morning, as though the decision had already been made and I was simply being informed of my role in it. 10 minutes after that first text, my sister sent a second one. Well, I made one call, not to her, to someone else entirely. And by the following morning, the ballroom my sister had shown off in that photo no longer had a booking under anyone's name at all. Before I tell you exactly what that call was, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this story is landing somewhere real. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from now. Let me take you back. I need to tell you about my sister before I tell you about the party, because the $7,200 text did not appear out of nowhere. It was the newest entry in a ledger that had been running, quietly, for most of our adult lives. And I did not fully understand the size of that ledger until the night I finally sat down and added it up. My sister Wendy is 38, 3 years younger than me. We grew up in a household where money was tight enough, often enough, that both of us absorbed very different lessons from the same scarcity. I responded to it by becoming careful, almost compulsively, so building an emergency fund the moment I had my first real paycheck, tracking every dollar with a specificity that occasionally makes people in my life roll their eyes. But that has also meant that by 41, working steadily for 18 years as a systems analyst for a regional healthcare network, I own my home outright. I have no debt, beyond a manageable mortgage I paid off early. And I have, by most measures, built a genuinely stable financial life. Wendy responded to the same scarcity differently. She became someone who believed, deeply and I think sincerely, that money existed to be spent on the things that mattered, that saving for tomorrow at the expense of today's joy was its own kind of loss. A philosophy I don't think is inherently wrong, except that it has meant, across 2 marriages, several career changes, and a consistent pattern of living slightly beyond whatever she was currently earning, that Wendy has spent most of her adult life financially unstable in a way that has, more and more over the years, become something the rest of the family quietly manages around rather than something anyone addresses directly. I want to describe our childhood a bit more because I think it's worth understanding where these 2 very different responses actually came from. Our father worked in manufacturing, a job that was stable for most of our childhood until a plant closure when I was 14 and Wendy was 11, followed by nearly 2 years of him cycling through lower-paying work while he retrained for a different field. Those 2 years were genuinely hard in ways that showed up differently for each of us. I remember, at 14, taking on a paper route and then, later, a job bagging groceries the moment I was legally old enough, contributing what I earned toward household expenses without really being asked to, because I could see, clearly enough, what was happening around me and wanted to help in whatever concrete way was available to a 14-year-old. Wendy, at 11, responded differently, understandably so, given the difference in our ages at the time. She became, I think, quietly anxious in a way that expressed itself less through practical contribution and more through a kind of grasping at whatever small joys were still available, insisting on birthday parties we probably couldn't afford, on the specific brand of sneakers her friends had, in a way that our parents, exhausted and stretched thin, often gave in to, I think partly out of their own guilt about what those 2 hard years were costing an 11-year-old's sense of normalcy. I don't say any of this to excuse what eventually happened with the Sweet 16. I say it because I think it's honest, and because I think stories like this one are more useful when they resist the temptation to make one sibling simply responsible and the other simply irresponsible, without acknowledging that both of us were shaped in different directions by the exact same set of circumstances, and that the specific ways we each learned to cope with financial instability as children followed us, largely unexamined, well into our 40s and 30s, respectively. I want to describe how that management has worked in practice, because I think the specific texture of it matters enormously to understanding the Sweet 16 text. When Wendy's first marriage ended 6 years ago, and she needed first and last month's rent for a new apartment on short notice, I covered it. $4,000, framed at the time by both of us as a loan, one that was never repaid, and that I eventually, quietly, stopped expecting to be repaid. When her car needed a transmission replacement 2 years ago, a repair she could not afford and could not do without given her job required driving, I paid for it directly, $2,200, again as a loan in name only. When Ava, my niece, needed braces 3 years ago, and Wendy's dental coverage didn't cover orthodontics, I paid the down payment and half of the monthly payments for the 18 months of treatment. Because, as Wendy put it at the time, you know how much this means to her confidence, Mel, and I do know that, genuinely. And I don't regret paying for my niece's braces even now, sitting here telling you this story. I want to walk through a few more of these, because I think the accumulation is the point, and I didn't fully feel the weight of the accumulation myself until I sat down, the week after the Sweet 16 text, and actually wrote every instance down on a single page. There was the $1,100 I sent 4 years ago, when Wendy's second marriage was falling apart, and she needed to break a lease early to move out before things escalated further. Money I sent within an hour of her asking, because the situation genuinely sounded urgent and I did not want her staying somewhere unsafe over a technicality about notice periods. There was the $600 for Ava's cheerleading uniform and competition fees, 2 years running, because Wendy told me, both years, that cutting Ava from the team over money would crush her, and I believed that, and I still believe it was true. There was $900 toward a used car for Wendy herself 18 months ago, framed, again, as a loan, with a repayment plan we sketched out together on a napkin at her kitchen table that neither of us ever actually followed up on. I want to be honest that I did all of these things, for years, without much resentment, because I loved my sister, and I loved my niece, and I had the resources to help in ways that felt each individual time proportionate and worthwhile. What I did not do across any of those years was add them up. I did not sit down and calculate the actual running total of what had moved from my accounts into my sister's life, framed each time as a loan, treated in practice as a gift, requested each time with just enough urgency that saying no felt, in the moment, like an act of real cruelty rather than a reasonable boundary. When I finally did the math, the week after the venue call, the total across those 6 years came to just under $19,000, not counting the braces, not counting the Sweet 16 deposit itself. $19,000, given in pieces small enough that no single instance of it had ever felt, on its own, like something worth having a serious conversation about. I also want to tell you about my mother's role in all of this, because I don't think this pattern existed purely between Wendy and me. I think it existed inside a larger family structure that had, for decades, quietly assigned each of us a role and then simply expected us to keep performing it. My mother, more than once over the years, would call me, gently, almost apologetically, to mention that Wendy was struggling with something, a phrasing that always managed to convey, without ever saying it directly, that I was the one who should probably step in. I love my mother, And I don't think she ever intended these calls as manipulation exactly. But I have come to understand, looking back, that she was performing a version of the same function Wendy eventually performed herself, quietly assuming my help was available on request without ever quite framing it as a request I was free to decline. The Sweet 16 was different, and I want to walk you through exactly how it unfolded, because the difference matters. Ava is turning 16 next month, and I had known, for a while, that Wendy wanted to do something meaningful for the occasion, the kind of milestone birthday that carries real weight in certain families, complete with the specific cultural expectations Wendy grew up wanting and never quite got to have herself. I had offered, months earlier, to contribute toward the celebration, a genuine, voluntary offer, up to $1,000 toward whatever Wendy decided to plan, an amount I felt comfortable with and that I communicated clearly in a text I still have saved in April, 4 months before the party date. I want to describe that April conversation a bit further because I think the contrast between it and what eventually happened in the following months is worth sitting with. When I offered the $1,000, I remember being genuinely excited about it, imagining a nice, modest celebration, something that would let Ava feel special without requiring anyone in the family to overextend themselves. Wendy responded warmly, at the time, saying something like, "That's so generous, Mel. Thank you. We'll figure out the rest." And I remember feeling good about the exchange, feeling like we were, for once, planning something together as equal contributors to a shared goal, rather than operating in the more familiar dynamic where I simply covered whatever gap appeared. I did not hear much more about the specifics of the planning after that, beyond occasional mentions that Wendy was looking into venues, which I assumed, reasonably, meant she was working within some version of a budget that included my $1,000, her own contribution, and whatever Ava's father, Wendy's ex-husband, was putting toward it as well. I did not ask for a full accounting, because I did not think, at that point, that I had any reason to. I want to mention, too, that in the weeks leading up to the text, there were a few small moments that, looking back now, probably should have registered as more significant than they did at the time. Wendy mentioned, in one phone call about 5 weeks before the party, that she was, quote, still finalizing the venue situation, in a tone that struck me, faintly, as more tense than the conversation warranted. I asked, at the time, whether everything was on track budget-wise, and she said, yes, totally fine. Don't worry about it, in a way that I now understand was less reassurance and more a kind of active deflection, though I had no reason, in that moment, to read it as anything other than what it appeared to be. I want to describe the moment I received that first text, because I remember it with unusual clarity. I was sitting on my couch, working through emails from my actual job, when my phone buzzed with a photo message from Wendy. A professionally decorated ballroom, string lights, a dessert table styled in gold and white, clearly a venue walkthrough photo, followed immediately by a second image, a printed catering menu with a total circled in pen. And then the text itself. Wire me $7,200 tonight for Ava's Sweet 16. Deposits due tomorrow morning. I read that text 3 times before I fully absorbed what it was actually saying. Not asking whether I could contribute an additional amount. Not asking what I might be comfortable adding beyond the $1,000 I'd already offered. A specific number, $7,200, framed as a settled fact rather than a request, with a deadline attached that gave me, functionally, until the following morning to comply. I opened my banking app almost immediately, not to send the money, but because some instinct, some small, uneasy signal I couldn't yet fully name, told me to check something first. I want to explain what I found, because it is the actual center of this entire story, and I think it deserves to be walked through carefully. 11 weeks earlier, I had given Wendy access to a shared family expense card, a secondary card on one of my credit accounts, for a completely unrelated and, at the time, entirely reasonable purpose. Our mother had needed a series of home health aid visits following a hip surgery, and rather than have 3 siblings, myself, Wendy, and our brother Curtis, each separately reimbursing a rotating home health agency, I had added Wendy as an authorized user on one of my cards specifically, so she, as the sibling handling most of the day-to-day coordination with the agency since she lived closest to, our mother could pay the agency directly, and I would simply see and cover the charges on my end, with Curtis reimbursing me his third each month. It was a practical, reasonable arrangement, and it had worked exactly as intended for the home health expenses, which I had been tracking and which Curtis had, in fact, been reimbursing consistently. I want to describe the specific conversation in which I gave Wendy that card, because I think the terms of it matter to understanding how clearly this later use fell outside what had actually been agreed. We sat at my kitchen table 11 weeks before the Sweet 16 text, and I handed her the physical card, and I said, explicitly, "This is only for the home health agency. Please don't use it for anything else, and if anything else comes up that you think it should cover, just ask me first and we'll figure it out together." She said, "Of course, obviously," in the easy, reassuring tone she has always been good at, the tone that has, I understand now, made saying yes to her feel simple for most of my life. I did not think, in that moment, that I needed to write anything down or set up alerts on the account or do anything beyond trust that the boundary I had just stated out loud would be respected. I have thought, many times since, about how differently that conversation might have gone if I had treated it with even a fraction of the formality I bring to actual financial contracts in my professional life, rather than the casual trust I extend, almost automatically, to family. What I found, scrolling through that account's recent activity that Tuesday evening, was a charge, dated 9 days earlier, for $2,400 to a venue called the Magnolia Room, described in the transaction as a non-refundable event deposit. I scrolled further back, methodically, the same careful habit that has served me well in 18 years of systems work, and found 2 additional charges I had not noticed before. Smaller ones, $180 to a bakery, and $95 to a party supply company, both dated within the same general window. Both, I would later confirm, entirely unrelated to our mother's home health care. I sat very still on my couch for a long moment, looking at that charge. Wendy had used the card I had given her, specifically and exclusively for our mother's home health expenses, to place a deposit on a Sweet 16 venue, without asking me, without telling me, 9 days before texting me a photo of that same venue and demanding I wire the remaining balance, as though the whole arrangement had already been agreed to. I want to describe the specific quality of what I felt in that moment, because I think it's important to be honest about it rather than skip to the resolution. It was not, at first, primarily anger, though anger arrived soon enough. It was something closer to a very precise, very cold clarity. The feeling of finally seeing, in a single, unambiguous transaction record, the actual shape of a pattern I had spent years participating in without ever fully naming. My sister had not asked me for help with the party. She had simply taken what she needed, using access I had given her for something else entirely, and was now presenting me with the bill for the rest, structured with a deadline tight enough to make questioning it feel, by design, like the unreasonable response. I also want to describe something else I noticed, sitting there with the transaction history open in front of me, which is how quickly my mind moved, almost reflexively, toward finding an innocent explanation. I remember thinking, for a genuine few minutes, maybe she was planning to ask me about the venue deposit separately and just hadn't gotten to it yet. Maybe there's a reasonable version of this where she intended to explain before the total came due. I want to be honest that this instinct, the immediate reach for the most generous possible reading of my sister's behavior, is itself a symptom of the exact pattern I am describing to you. A lifetime of training myself to assume good intent on her part, even when the evidence in front of me was, increasingly, difficult to reconcile with that assumption. It took the second text, the single word well, sent exactly 10 minutes after the first, with no acknowledgement at all of the deposit charge I now knew about, to finally push me past that reflexive generosity into something clearer. I did not respond to Wendy's text right away. I sat with it, deliberately, for the full 10 minutes I mentioned earlier, because I needed that time to move past the initial cold shock and into something clearer, something closer to an actual plan rather than a reaction. At the end of those 10 minutes, my phone buzzed again. Well, I still did not respond to her directly. Instead, I made a call, and I want to explain exactly what that call was, because I think the mechanics of it matter enormously, the same way they mattered in a story I've told on this channel before about a different kind of unauthorized use. I called my credit card issuer's fraud and disputes line. I explained that I had recently discovered a charge on my account made by an authorized secondary user for a purpose entirely outside the scope of what that authorization had been granted for, and I asked what my options were. The representative, a calm, methodical man named Desmond, walked me through it clearly. He asked me a series of careful, procedural questions first, standard identity verification, then a question that I remember precisely because it forced me to say the situation out loud, in plain terms, for the first time. He asked, "Can you describe, in your own words, what the secondary cardholder was authorized to use this card for?" I said, "Home health aid payments for our mother. That's it. Nothing else." And that was communicated directly and clearly at the time the card was issued. He asked whether that agreement had been documented anywhere beyond a verbal conversation. I told him, honestly, no, only spoken at my kitchen table 11 weeks earlier. He explained that as the primary account holder, I retained full authority over the account regardless of what a secondary authorized user did with the card, and that while the $2,400 charge to the Magnolia Room was not, strictly speaking, unauthorized in the narrowest legal sense, since Wendy did have a valid card number and had not stolen anything, I absolutely had the right, as the primary holder, to dispute the charge on the grounds that it fell outside the specific, previously agreed purpose for which the card access had been granted, and, separately and more immediately, to remove Wendy's authorized user status from the account entirely, effective immediately, which would prevent any further charges from being placed at all. I asked Desmond how the dispute process typically worked in a situation like this, where the underlying facts weren't outright fraud in the criminal sense, but were still, clearly, a misuse of the specific terms under which access had been granted. He explained that these disputes, sometimes called authorized user misuse cases internally, are handled somewhat differently than a standard fraud claim, since the account issuer's primary concern is protecting the account holder's overall financial exposure, rather than adjudicating a family disagreement about intent. He said, "Practically speaking, my strongest position was not necessarily pursuing the dispute through the card issuer at all, since that process could take weeks and might not fully resolve the underlying situation with the venue itself, but rather using my standing as the actual cardholder to contact the merchant directly, since merchants, in his experience, are often more responsive to a cardholder's direct request than to a formal dispute filed after the fact, particularly when the transaction is recent and the cardholder is contacting them proactively rather than reactively." I asked Desmond one more question, because it was the question that actually mattered most in that moment. I asked whether, as the account holder, I had any standing to contact the venue directly, given that the deposit had been placed using my card under circumstances I had not authorized. He told me that yes, I did, since the card on file for that reservation was ultimately mine, and that venues, in his professional experience handling disputes like this, are generally quite responsive to a cardholder contacting them directly about a booking made under contested circumstances, particularly one that involves a family member using a card without the account holder's full knowledge of its intended purpose. I removed Wendy's authorized user status from the account that night, immediately, while still on the phone with Desmond, watching the confirmation screen update in real time as he processed the change. I remember watching that status change from active to removed, a strange combination of relief and grief. Relief at having done something concrete, grief at what the necessity of doing it represented about where things actually stood between my sister and me. The following morning, before the venue's stated deposit deadline, I called the Magnolia Room directly. I want to describe that call in full because I think the specific way it unfolded matters to the story. I spoke with the events coordinator, a woman named Priscilla, and explained, calmly and factually, that the deposit for the reservation under my sister's name had been placed using a card belonging to me, for a purpose I had not authorized, and that I was contacting her as the actual cardholder to request that the reservation be canceled and the deposit reversed, given the circumstances. Priscilla was, understandably, a bit taken aback and asked, reasonably, whether this was something my sister was aware I was doing. I told her, honestly, that my sister was not yet aware, but that as the person whose card had actually been used, I had every right to contact her directly about a charge on my own account. A point Priscilla, after checking with her manager, ultimately agreed with, confirming that the reservation had been made using a card that legally belonged to me, and that per their own policy, the actual cardholder retained authority over disputes related to that card, regardless of whose name appeared on the event booking itself. Priscilla asked me to hold for several minutes while she reviewed the account with her manager, a man named Bartholomew, who eventually got on the phone directly. He explained that while their standard policy treated event deposits as non-refundable, an exception existed for cases where the cardholder of record disputed the charge within a defined window, provided the cardholder could verify their identity and their relationship to the card used, both of which I was able to do easily, given that Desmond had already flagged the account overnight following our call. Bartholomew told me, candidly, that this was not the first time his venue had encountered a situation like this. A family member booking an event using a card that wasn't fully theirs to commit, and that the venue had, in fact, built a specific internal process for exactly this scenario, precisely because it came up often enough to warrant one. I asked Bartholomew, out of genuine curiosity as much as anything else, how often this kind of situation actually happened. He told me, without much hesitation, that it was more common than people might assume, particularly around milestone events like Sweet 16s, weddings, and quinceañeras, where the emotional stakes of the celebration itself sometimes led one family member to make commitments on another's behalf, assuming, incorrectly, that the financial details would simply sort themselves out later. He said, "We've actually had situations go the other direction too, where a cardholder wanted the event to proceed even after learning it had been booked without their full knowledge, because the relationship mattered more to them than the process." I told him that I appreciated him sharing that, and that it helped me understand this wasn't some unusually dramatic overreaction on my part, but a genuinely recognized category of situation that his industry had learned to accommodate. He walked me through the specific documentation needed to finalize the cancellation and refund, a straightforward process given the circumstances, and confirmed that the refund would post to my account within 5 to 7 business days, pending final review by their finance team, a timeline that, in the end, held exactly as promised. By that Wednesday afternoon, less than 24 hours after the original text, the reservation at the Magnolia Room no longer existed under anyone's name. The $2,400 deposit was refunded to my account, pending final review, and the remaining balance Wendy had been planning to have me wire, The $7,200 was no longer attached to anything at all. I want to describe what happened next because it happened fast, and it happened in a way that I think revealed a great deal about how my sister actually understood our relationship underneath years of careful, easier framing. Wendy called me first, around noon that Wednesday, and I let it go to voicemail because I was still, honestly, gathering myself for the conversation I knew was coming. She called again 15 minutes later. I answered that time. She was immediately not calm. She said, "Melanie, what did you do? The venue just called me. They said the reservation's been canceled. They said you called them? Is that true?" I said, "Yes, it's true." I canceled it because the deposit was placed using a card I gave you specifically and only for Mom's home health expenses, without my knowledge. And I was not going to simply wire you an additional $7,200 for a party I never actually agreed to fund at that level. She said, "I can't believe you would do this to Ava." I said, "Wendy, I didn't do anything to Ava. You did something to me, using a card I trusted you with for something else entirely. And then you tried to present me with the bill for it as though the decision had already been made without me. Those are two very different things, and I need you to actually hear the difference." She said, "So what? I'm supposed to just not have a party for my own daughter because you're being petty about a card I was going to pay you back for?" I said, "Wendy, were you going to pay back the $2,400 deposit? Because that's not what your text said. Your text said, wire me $7,200. Not I used the card for a deposit and I need help with the rest. Can we talk about it?" Those are fundamentally different requests, and I think you know that, because if you'd actually planned to ask me properly, you would have asked before placing the deposit, not after, with a threat about tomorrow's deadline attached. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I want to repeat exactly, because I think it captures, more clearly than almost anything else in this entire story, the actual belief system underneath years of this pattern. She said, "I used the card because I knew you'd say yes eventually. You always say yes eventually. I just didn't want to go through weeks of asking and explaining and justifying every line item. I thought it would just be easier this way." I sat with that sentence for a long moment before responding. I said, "Wendy, you just told me, directly, that you decided asking me properly wasn't worth the effort because you'd already concluded my answer didn't actually matter. Only my money did. Do you understand how that sounds, said out loud like that?" She did not have an immediate answer to that. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I actually checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Finally, she said, "I don't know what you want me to say, Melanie." I said, "I don't want you to say anything specific right now. I want you to actually sit with what you just admitted, because I think it's the first completely honest thing you've said to me about any of this in years, and I don't think you fully understood until you heard yourself say it out loud, how it actually sounds from the outside." She tried a different approach after that, her voice shifting into something more pleading. She said, "Melanie, please, the party's in 6 weeks. Everything's already planned around that venue. The theme, the photographer, everything. If you don't help me figure this out, I don't know what I'm going to tell Ava." I said, "Wendy, I understand this is stressful, and I'm not trying to punish Ava, who I love and who had nothing to do with any of this. But I am not going to solve this problem by simply doing exactly what you originally demanded, because that would teach you exactly the wrong lesson, that taking without asking and then pressuring me works, eventually, if you just hold firm long enough. I am willing to help find a version of this party that actually fits a real budget, one we agree on together in advance. I am not willing to simply reopen the reservation you booked without me and cover the difference. I want to talk about the texts that came after that call because they are, I think, the part of this story that most people find hardest to believe, and I want to be precise about them rather than paraphrasing. About 20 minutes after we hung up, Wendy texted. That's it then. If you're going to humiliate me like this over money, you're not welcome at anything going forward. Not the party, not holidays, nothing. A second text, a few minutes later, if you cared about this family at all, you wouldn't have made that call. You've made your choice. I want to describe what it felt like reading those texts because I think it is worth being honest about. It did not feel like losing something precious that I desperately wanted to hold on to. It felt, more than anything, like watching, in real time, exactly how conditional my place in this particular dynamic had always actually been. Contingent, apparently, on my continued willingness to fund things without question, and evaporating the instant that willingness had limits. I did not respond to either of those texts right away. I want to be honest that I needed a day to sit with the full weight of what had just happened, not just the financial dispute, but the speed and totality with which my sister had apparently been willing to cut me out entirely, the moment I stopped simply providing what was expected of me. I remember sitting on my couch that evening, the same couch where I'd first opened that photo of the ballroom less than 48 hours earlier, feeling a strange, quiet grief that had almost nothing to do with money at all. The grief of realizing, with total clarity, exactly how much of my relationship with my sister had been built on a foundation I had never once tested until that week. I called our brother Curtis the next day, partly because I needed to talk it through with someone who understood the family dynamics, and partly because he was, after all, the third party to the original home health card arrangement and deserved to know what had happened with it. Curtis, to his credit, was not surprised, in a way that was its own kind of revealing. He said, "Mel, I've watched this happen in smaller ways for years. You're the one who fixes things, so nobody in this family, including me if I'm honest, has ever had to think very hard about what it actually costs you to keep fixing them." I think Wendy genuinely believed, walking into this, that you'd be upset for a day and then wire the money anyway, because that's the pattern that's held for years. I don't think she had a real plan for what happens if you actually said no. I asked Curtis to be honest with me about something I'd been turning over since the call with Wendy. I asked whether he thought I had somehow contributed to this by being too available, too willing, for too long. He was quiet for a moment before answering, which I appreciated, because it meant he was actually considering it rather than simply reassuring me. He said, "I think you contributed to it the way anyone contributes to a pattern by not stopping it the first several times it happens. But I don't think that makes what Wendy did your fault. There's a difference between being generous in a way that maybe went on longer than it should have and actively taking something from someone without asking. You did the first thing. She did the second thing. Those aren't the same category of responsibility, even if they're connected." I told Curtis about the specific sentence Wendy had said on the phone about knowing I'd say yes eventually, and asked him what he made of it. He said, "I think that's actually the most useful thing that's come out of this whole mess, honestly, because now it's said out loud instead of just being the quiet assumption everyone in this family has apparently been operating on for years, including me, if I'm being fully honest with myself. I've asked you for help too, over the years. Smaller things, sure, but I don't think I've always asked as carefully as I should have either." I asked Curtis directly whether he thought I had done the right thing, canceling the reservation the way I had. He said, "I think you did the only thing that was ever going to actually change anything. Every other time you've helped Wendy, it's reinforced the exact belief she just told you out loud, that your yes doesn't require an actual ask. This is the first time in years that hasn't been true, and I think that's exactly why she reacted the way she did. It's not really about the party. It's about the pattern breaking for the first time in front of her." I also spoke with my mother a few days later, because I knew Wendy would have already told her some version of events, and I wanted my mother to hear the actual sequence of what had happened directly from me, rather than only through whatever framing Wendy had chosen. My mother listened, mostly quietly, while I walked her through the timeline, the card, the deposit, the text, the calls. When I finished, she said, "Melanie, I think I owe you an apology too. Actually, one that's been a long time coming. I've spent years calling you when your sister needed something, framing it gently, hoping you'd step in without me ever having to ask directly, because asking directly felt uncomfortable. I think I taught her, without meaning to, that this is simply how the family works, that you're the one who solves things and the rest of us don't have to think too hard about what that costs you. I'm sorry for my part in that." I asked my mother, gently, why she thought it had always felt easier to route these requests through me indirectly rather than addressing them with Wendy directly herself. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised me with its honesty. She said, "I think, if I'm being truthful, it's because addressing it with Wendy directly would have meant admitting, to myself, that she needed more help managing money than I was ever equipped to actually give her. It was easier to lean on you because you were capable, and because leaning on you didn't require me to have a harder conversation with her about patterns I didn't know how to fix anyway." I told my mother that I understood that, and that I didn't think it made her a bad parent, but that I hoped, going forward, all three of us, she, Wendy, and I, could find a way to address things more directly, rather than routing difficult conversations through whichever family member happened to be easiest to lean on in the moment. I told my mother I appreciated her saying that, and that I hoped, going forward, we could all be more honest, as a family, about what help actually meant, rather than letting it stay this unspoken current running underneath everything. She said she would try. I believe she meant it, though I also understand the way you understand these things about people you've known your whole life, that old patterns take real, sustained effort to actually change, not just a single good conversation. I want to tell you about the conversation Wendy and I eventually did have about 2 weeks later, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that everything simply ended in a flurry of angry texts with no further contact at all. Wendy called me, this time in a noticeably different tone, and asked if we could talk properly, in person, rather than over the phone. We met at a coffee shop, neutral ground, the kind of place that felt easier for both of us than either of our homes. I want to describe walking into that coffee shop, because I remember feeling genuinely uncertain, right up until I sat down across from her, about which version of my sister I was going to encounter. The one from the angry texts or something closer to the person I'd known for most of my life before any of this happened. She looked tired, in a way that suggested the 2 weeks had not been easy for her either, and she had a folder with her, sitting on the table between us, which she opened almost immediately, before either of us had even ordered anything. She said, "Melanie, I've had 2 weeks to think about what I said, and I want to tell you that the 'you're not welcome anymore' text was said out of panic and shame, not out of what I actually believe." I said, "I appreciate you saying that, and I need you to understand that whether or not you meant it in that specific moment, it revealed something true about how conditional you'd let our relationship become, at least on your end. And that's not something I can just set aside because you've since reconsidered it." She said, "I know. I've been sitting with that too." She pushed the folder toward me, and inside it was a handwritten list, dated, of every instance of financial help I'd given her over the past 6 years that she herself could remember. A list that was, notably, shorter than the one I'd made myself the week before, missing several smaller instances I'd counted, but including everything major. She said, "I made this because I wanted to actually see it, the way you must have seen it, before you made that call. I think I needed to write it down myself to understand why you finally said no." I asked her, directly, whether she understood why using the card the way she had was different from simply asking me for help, the way she had many times before. She said, "I think I do now, though I'll be honest. In the moment, it didn't feel like a big deal. It felt like a shortcut. And I think that's the actual problem, that taking shortcuts through you had started to feel normal to me, because you'd never really stopped me before." I told her that was, unfortunately, the most honest thing she'd said in the entire situation, and that going forward, I needed our financial relationship to look completely different than it had for the past several years. I told her I was not removing myself from Ava's life, and that the offer I had made in April, the $1,000 toward the party, still stood. If Wendy wanted to plan something within a budget, that $1,000, her own contribution, and Ava's father's contribution could actually support. What I was not willing to do, going forward, was continue being an unspoken, unlimited backstop that got activated through demands rather than requests, structured with deadlines designed to make questioning them feel unreasonable. She asked whether this meant I'd never help her again. I told her, honestly, no, that wasn't what it meant. It meant that help, going forward, would need to look like an actual conversation, with an actual amount I'd agreed to in advance, rather than a bill presented to me after the fact for a decision I'd never been part of making. I suggested, and she agreed, that if she ever needed to ask me for something significant again, she would send me an actual message laying out the situation and the amount, with enough time for me to genuinely consider it, rather than a demand with an attached deadline designed to make refusal feel impossible. Ava ended up having her sweet 16 about 6 weeks later than originally planned, at a smaller venue, a nice private room at a restaurant rather than the ballroom at the Magnolia Room, funded by my original $1,000 contribution, Wendy's own savings, and a contribution from Ava's father that, as it turned out, had been considerably smaller than Wendy had led me to believe during the original planning, which I think explains a fair amount about why the gap I was being asked to cover was as large as it was. I attended. Ava had a wonderful time, by every account, including her own. And I want to be honest that watching her celebrate in a smaller room with people who genuinely loved her felt, if anything, more meaningful than the ballroom photo Wendy had originally sent me ever could have. I want to tell you about one conversation I had with Ava herself at that party, because I think it belongs in this story, even though she had no direct part in what happened between her mother and me. She found me near the dessert table at one point during the evening and said, quietly, "Aunt Mel, I know something happened with the original venue. Mom wouldn't tell me exactly what, but I want you to know I actually like this place better anyway. It feels more like us." I told her I was glad, genuinely, and that I loved her very much, and that nothing that had happened between her mother and me was ever about her. She said, "I kind of figured that out on my own, actually." I told her that was a very perceptive thing to figure out at 16, and she said, "Well, I've had a lot of practice watching how this family works." I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else from that entire evening. I've had a lot of practice watching how this family works. It struck me, hearing it from a 16-year-old, how visible these patterns actually are, even to the people we sometimes assume are too young or too distant from the details to notice them. Ava had been watching this dynamic play out for her entire life, absorbing, in whatever quiet way children absorb these things, the same lesson I had absorbed at her age, that certain people in a family exist to give and certain people exist to receive, and that the roles rarely get questioned out loud until something forces the question into the open. I asked Ava, gently, whether she'd ever felt caught in the middle of it, between her mother and me, over the years. She thought about it for a moment, in the careful, considered way 16-year-olds sometimes surprise you with, and said, "Not really caught, more just aware, I guess. Like I always kind of knew you were the one who made sure things worked out, and I think some part of me worried, honestly, that eventually you'd get tired of it and just stop being around as much." I told her, as honestly as I could, that what had happened with the venue was never going to change how much I loved her or how present I intended to remain in her life, and that if anything, I hoped this whole situation might eventually mean our family got a little more honest with each other in ways that would actually be good for her too, going forward, not just for her mother and me. She hugged me, at that point, tightly, in the specific way teenagers do when they're trying not to let you see how much something actually moved them, and said, "Thanks for still coming, Aunt Mel, even after